Old Gold was operated by McRobertson Miller Airlines in Western Australia until single-engine passenger planes became unpopular due to the frequency of their crashes. Then she was sent to New Guinea and operated as a freight carrier until she crashed and was destroyed by fire in 1936. The DH-61 Giant Moth was powered by a single Bristol Jupiter XL radial motor of 500 horsepower or 373 kilowatt, and she carried 8 passengers. Have a look at the bare-headed bloke in front of the wing smoking a cigarette. With all that 91 octane fuel being splashed around and the stack of crates, each with 2 4-gallon cans of fuel, and the kids in the cart with no one holding the reins, a disaster waiting to happen. I don't think you'd get away with any of that. This is the aircraft could have begun an airplane building industry for Australia. The tri-motor Lasseter. Lasseter vh-umy was built in 1929 by Lasseter, that's Larkin Aircraft Supply Company, and was the only one ever built. Its production followed the first all-metal aircraft to be built in Australia, the Lasseter. Herbert Joseph Larkin, nicknamed Jimmy, bought out a British aircraft designer to design an all-Australian airplane for Australian conditions, and the Lasseter seemed to be a very successful airplane for the job. Lasseter was originally chartered by New South Wales pastoralist Donald Mackay for his upcoming aerial survey of the interior of Australia. This would have been a terrific boost for Lasseter and also for a budding aircraft building industry. But Lasseter suffered moderate damage when landing at Coode Island and was not ready for Mackay when he needed it. Mackay then chartered 2 Annex 3s, Diamond Bird and Lovebird, for his survey. After repairs, Lasseter was put on the Queensland to Northern Territory mail run, and on one of the return trips from Daly Waters she had a wing engine failure and was forced to land at Camberwell and swap the blown wing motor with the fuselage motor. She then carried on to Cloncurry on 2 motors but still had problems and never got off the ground again. This was during the Great Depression, and Larkin was financially overstretched and forced into liquidation. Everything of value was stripped from Lasseter and the skeleton was towed out to a nearby station property. Everything of value was stripped from Lasseter and the skeleton was towed out to a nearby station property where she was pushed into a bulldozed hole and buried. This was a very sad end to a great venture. In 1930, Harold Bell Lasseter approached the Australian Workers' Union for assistance in rediscovering the reef of gold that he claimed to have discovered in the extreme northwest of South Australia several years previously. The executives of the union formed a company, Central Australian Gold Exploration, purchased the aeroplane, trucks and equipment, and set up a base camp at Ilbilba, some 120 miles west of the Alice. All supplies for the camp were carted by Bob Buck, using one of the camel trains that had built the Northern Railway extension to Alice Springs. After the first aircraft crashed, they purchased another, and it was flown to the Ilbilba camp by the previous owner. It was named Golden Quest 2, and its registration was vh-ugy. After arriving at Ilbilba, Lasseter got the pilot to fly him south to where he reckoned the reef was and returned after only 2 hours, claiming to have spotted the reef. Cage then sent the Thornycroft out to locate the reef but couldn't find a track through the breakaways, so they returned to camp. Lasseter then sent off with a team of camels accompanied by a dingo trapper named Johns, but only after a few days they had an argument and Johns returned, leaving Lasseter to continue with just a few camels. A couple of days later the camels bolted, leaving Lasseter with very few provisions. But luckily some Aboriginals found him and took him to a cave in an area called Tajunta, where he existed for about 60 days. By now the company was fed up with Lasseter and his reef and decided to finish the expedition. In spite of the chief pilot, Coote, wanting to go and search for Lasseter, They returned to Adelaide, hanging Lasseter out to dry, so to speak. Lasseter waited in vain for someone to rescue him, but his condition was so weakened he decided to walk out. He wrote letters and buried them with the diary on the floor of the cave and started to walk. He didn't get far and perished. Some Aborigines found his body and they buried it. Several years later, Bob Buck, a pastoralist, found the grave and returned the body and the documents found in the cave to Alice Springs, where the grave and a carved sandstone memorial exist today. It's an appalling indictment on the cage officials who made the deliberate decision to leave Lasseter. Les Holden refuelling the Canberra vh-umy in Alice Springs after he'd located missing Southern Cross aircraft with Kingsford Smith on the West Australian coast, where he was forced to land during a trip to England. Canberra, a DH-61 giant moth, then diverted to find a missing gypsy moth kookaburra with two men, Anderson and Hitchcock, who had joined in the search for the Southern Cross. Canberra was forced to land at Alice Springs for refuelling, and whilst there, Atlantis, flown by Lasseter Brain, found the missing moth kookaburra in the Tanami Desert. With both men alive, but Brain being unable to land, he returned to the Alice. The pilot of the kookaburra, Anderson, had made an emergency landing, and after fixing the problem, the two men tried to hack out a takeoff strip with their bare hands. A Thornycroft four-wheel drive truck was sent out to the Tanami, but by the time they reached the site, both men had perished. Their bodies were taken back to the Alice, but the plane was left for many years, and when eventually recovered by our own Dick Smith, it was barely recognisable as an aeroplane due to damage by bushfire and the elements. This is the front and back cover of Wings Over the Aussie Outback. Wings Over the Aussie Outback is a paperback book of 26 black and white pages, 8 by 10 inches, with 24 large-size, copyright grayscale, high-resolution photographs dating from 1928 to 1931 of the different aircraft using the outback of Australia. The photographs were taken by my father, Bob Rumble, as he travelled extensively through the outback as a representative of the Shell Company. I have restored the photographs from the original prints. The negatives had long ago disintegrated.